In March 2022, in McLean County, Illinois, 23-year-old Emily Carter stood beside a muddy cattle trailer and watched 6 grown men struggle to unload a bull nobody else wanted. The animal was enormous. He was an American Brahman Hereford cross, nearly 2,000 pounds, with a white coat so pale it looked silver beneath the gray Illinois sky. His eyes were pink-rimmed. His broad shoulders filled the trailer opening. A faded blue ear tag hung from his left ear. Everyone at Carter Farm had already heard the jokes. "That's not a bull," one neighbor had said. "That's a county liability." Emily hadn't laughed. She was standing in worn brown work boots, faded jeans, a canvas jacket, and gloves darkened by 3 years of repairing a farm that had almost nothing left to give. Her father had died before she finished high school. Her mother had moved to Indiana after the funeral. The farm debt remained. The bank wanted $41,700. Emily had 12 cattle, a 1964 Farm LM, a collapsing equipment shed, and exactly $1,186 in her checking account. Then the trailer arrived. The man who climbed out of the cab was Harold Voss, 61, owner of Voss Creek Cattle Company and one of the largest cattlemen in the county. He didn't shake Emily's hand. "We need him somewhere for the spring," Harold said. Emily looked at the bull. "Why here?" Harold glanced toward the farmhouse. "Because nobody else will take him." That answer should have been enough. It wasn't. The bull suddenly slammed his shoulder against the trailer wall. The metal rang across the pasture. One of Harold's men stepped backward. Emily didn't. She watched the bull's feet. Not his horns. Not his size. His feet. The animal wasn't charging. He was trying not to step on something. Emily moved closer. "Open the lower gate," she said. Harold frowned. "What?" "The back left corner." "Emily, don't." "Open it." Something in her voice made the men obey. The lower gate swung outward. The bull backed away from the corner, lowered his head, and stepped into the mud. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then he walked straight toward Emily. She could hear his breathing. Heavy, slow, controlled. He stopped 6 feet away. Emily noticed a scar beneath his right shoulder. Old wire injury. But beneath the scar was something else. A strange circular patch where the hair was thinner. She crouched. The bull watched her. "You've been tied up," she whispered. Harold crossed his arms. "He's been handled plenty." Emily looked up. "Not gently." Harold's face tightened. "Just keep him alive until May." That was when Emily understood this wasn't a favor. They weren't lending her their best bull. They were getting rid of a problem. And they had chosen a young woman with a failing farm because they assumed she wouldn't know the difference. By sunset, the bull was standing alone in Emily's north pasture. She had named him Atlas before she even knew whether he deserved the name. Her grandfather had once told her that cattle showed you what was wrong with a pasture before soil tests did. Emily remembered that sentence as she watched Atlas ignore the expensive mineral feeder and walk directly toward the old hayfield. He stopped beside a dead patch of grass. Then he began pawing. Once, twice, 3 times. Emily walked over. She expected buried wire. Instead, she found black soil beneath the dry surface. She rubbed it between her fingers. Moist, rich, different from the rest of the field. Atlas pawed again. Emily stared at the ground. The bull had been delivered to her as a breeding problem. But he was already showing her something nobody had noticed. The next morning, she called the county extension office. A man named Dennis Cole answered. Dennis was 54, an agricultural consultant who had spent 30 years telling farmers what worked and what didn't. Emily explained Atlas's history. Dennis laughed. "That's the white bull Harold's been trying to unload?" "Yes." "You paid for him?" "No." "Then you got exactly what he's worth." Emily looked through the kitchen window toward the pasture. Atlas was standing beneath the old cottonwood. "What makes you say that?" "Genetics, temperament, breeding history. Those things matter. He has a good frame. Lots of bad bulls have good frames." Emily said nothing. Dennis continued. "Don't put him with your heifers." "Why?" "Because if he throws badly, you won't know until next year." Emily looked at Atlas again. "He hasn't been aggressive." "That doesn't make him valuable." The call ended. Emily set the phone down. Outside, Atlas turned his head toward the barn. He had begun staring at something. Emily followed his gaze. Her grandfather's old wooden breeding records box sat beneath the porch. She hadn't opened it since the funeral. Inside were handwritten notes from 30 years of cattle herds, pasture rotations, calving dates, weights, illnesses, and bloodlines. Emily carried the box to the kitchen table. The first pages smelled like dust and old tobacco. Then she found a name she recognized. Atlas's mother, a registered cow called Silverbell. Emily's finger stopped. Beside the name, her grandfather had written one sentence. Best maternal line we ever owned. Never sell the daughters. Emily read it twice. Then she found Atlas's sire. Another name, another note. Exceptional feed conversion. Quiet temperament. Heavy weaning weights. Emily's heartbeat quickened. This wasn't a worthless bull. But there was a problem. Half the records were missing. And the missing pages cover the exact years when Atlas was born. That afternoon, Harold Voss returned. He stood by the fence while Atlas watched him from 50 yards away. "How's he doing?" Harold asked. Emily didn't answer immediately. "Why did you really send him here?" Harold smiled. "Already trying to solve the mystery?" "I found his breeding records." The smile disappeared. For the first time since the trailer arrived, Harold looked nervous. "Those records don't mean anything." "Why?" "Because the bull never proved himself." Emily glanced at Atlas. "Then why are you afraid I might prove him?" Harold's jaw tightened. He looked across the pasture. "Girl, you have 12 cows and a bank breathing down your neck. Don't turn this into something it isn't." Then he walked away. Emily waited until his truck disappeared down the gravel road. Atlas lowered his head. He began pawing the same patch of ground. Emily stepped closer. This time, something metallic appeared beneath his hoof. She knelt in the mud. It was an old brass ear tag, not Atlas's, and stamped into the metal were 3 numbers Emily recognized from her grandfather's missing records. 417. She looked toward the road where Harold had disappeared, then back at the enormous white bull. For the first time, Emily wondered whether Atlas hadn't been sent to her because nobody wanted him. Maybe someone wanted her to find something. Emily did not sleep much that night. The brass tag sat on the kitchen table, beside her grandfather's cattle records. She turned it over beneath the yellow light. Nothing on the front, nothing on the back. But the number was written in the same narrow handwriting her grandfather had used in the old breeding ledger. At 5:12 the next morning, Emily was already outside. The temperature had dropped below freezing. Frost covered the fence wire. Atlas stood at the far end of the pasture, his white back almost disappearing into the pale morning fog. Emily walked toward him carrying a bucket of mineral. He ignored the bucket. Instead, he walked to the same patch of ground and pawed once. Emily stopped. "You really wanted to look there, don't you?" Atlas pawed again. She fetched a shovel. The first 6 inches were ordinary. The next layer wasn't. Emily struck something hard. She scraped away the soil and uncovered a flat piece of black plastic. Under was an old concrete marker, and carved into the concrete were the numbers. 417, Silver Bell Line. Emily sat back on her heels. The missing records suddenly had a location. Her grandfather hadn't simply recorded cattle. He had been tracking a bloodline, a very specific one. Emily returned to the farmhouse and pulled every old folder from the closet. At 7:40, she found a photograph. Her grandfather stood beside a massive white bull nearly 20 years earlier. The bull had the same broad forehead as Atlas, the same deep chest, the same pale eyes. On the back of the photograph were 4 words: "Do not lose this line." Emily stared at it. Then she noticed the date, September 2004, and underneath it, another name, Cedar Ridge 417. She knew that name. Every cattleman in McLean County did. Cedar Ridge 417 had supposedly been one of the best natural service sires in central Illinois before disappearing from public breeding records. Emily had always assumed it was just another story older farmers told. Now she was holding the photograph, and Atlas was standing outside. The same bloodline. But why had nobody told her? At 10 o'clock, Emily drove her father's old pickup into town. She went to the county extension office. Dennis Cole was standing beside a copier when she put the photograph on his desk. His expression changed immediately. "Where did you get this?" "My grandfather." Dennis picked up the photograph. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he looked at Emily. "Your grandfather bred Cedar Ridge for 17? "I think so." "You think?" "Half the records are missing." Dennis slowly lowered himself into his chair. "That bull changed your grandfather's herd." "How?" "He consistently produced calves with strong growth, good feet, quiet dispositions, and unusually efficient feed conversion." Emily felt her stomach tighten. "Then why did the line disappear?" Dennis looked toward the window. "That is the question." Before he could continue, the office door opened. Harold Voss walked in. He saw the photograph. His face hardened. "Where did you get that?" Emily didn't answer. Harold walked toward the desk. "Those animals are irrelevant." Dennis stood. "You know they're not." Harold's voice dropped. "Some things should stay buried." Emily looked between the two men. "What happened in 2004? Neither answered. That silence told her more than words could have. Harold finally said, "Your grandfather made a mistake." "What mistake?" "He trusted the wrong people." Then he left. Emily turned to Dennis. "What does that mean?" Dennis shook his head. "You should ask your grandmother." Emily hadn't thought about her grandmother. She had moved to Iowa after her husband's death and rarely discussed the farm anymore. Emily called her that afternoon. Her grandmother answered on the fourth ring. "Emily?" "Grandma, what was Cedar Ridge for 17? Silence. Then a long breath. "Where did you hear that name?" "Grandpa's records." Another silence. "Your grandfather believed Atlas came from that line." "He does." Her grandmother didn't sound surprised. "He always hoped someone would finish what he started." "What happened?" "Bad winter. Bad debt. Bad advice." Emily waited. "Your grandfather had developed a small herd around that bloodline," her grandmother said. "The cattle were remarkable, but a feed shortage hit. The bank wanted assets sold. Your grandfather refused to sell the breeding females." "What happened?" "He sold the bull instead." Emily closed her eyes. "And who bought him?" Her grandmother hesitated. "Voss." Emily looked toward the pasture. Atlas was standing near the fence. "Harold." "Yes." Emily suddenly understood. Harold hadn't sent her a random bull. He had sent back something her grandfather had lost. But there was still a missing piece. "Grandma," Emily asked, "why does Atlas have the same number?" Her grandmother's voice became quieter. "Because Atlas isn't the beginning of the line." "What is?" "The cows." The call ended shortly afterward. Emily drove home before dark. She opened the cattle gate and walked into the pasture. Atlas approached slowly. Emily placed her hand against his neck. His hide was warm beneath her palm. "You're not the problem," she whispered. Atlas breathed against her shoulder. "You're the answer to something." But the next morning brought a problem. 3 of Emily's cows had developed swollen udders. One had stopped eating. The veterinarian arrived before noon. He examined them carefully. "Change in pasture?" Emily shook her head. "Feed." "No." "Mineral?" "Same as always." The veterinarian frowned. "Then I'd test the water." Emily stared at him. The cattle trough came from an old shallow well behind the barn. Her grandfather had used it for decades. Emily pumped the handle. The water came out brown for 3 seconds. Then clear. She filled a glass jar. There was a faint metallic smell. She called the county. A water technician arrived the following afternoon. The result was worse than Emily expected. The well contained elevated nitrates. Not enough to kill healthy adult cattle immediately, but enough to interfere with performance. Emily stood beside the technician. "How long?" "Could be years." She looked toward the pasture. "Then why didn't we know?" The technician shrugged. "Most people don't test old farm wells until something goes wrong." Emily looked at Atlas. He wasn't drinking from the trough. He had been avoiding it. Instead, he had been drinking from a shallow spring along the north fence. Emily suddenly remembered the first morning. Atlas had ignored the mineral feeder. He had avoided the trough. He had pawed the soil. He had been showing her the healthier part of the farm. The bull wasn't merely surviving. He was reading the land. That evening, Emily moved the herd toward the spring. Within 2 days, the cows were eating normally again. But Emily had a bigger problem. Her spring pasture was too small. If she bred Atlas there, she couldn't support enough cows to make the operation profitable. She needed money. She went to the bank. The loan officer studied her numbers. You want to borrow $18,000? For fencing, water lines, and breeding infrastructure. With 12 cows. I want to expand to 25. The banker almost smiled. And your collateral? Emily slid a photograph across the desk. Atlas. The banker looked at it. A bull isn't collateral. He is if the calves are worth more than the debt. The banker leaned back. You're betting everything on an improving, sire. Emily didn't argue. She simply said, give me 1 season. The banker denied the loan. Emily walked outside. Rain had started. Cold March rain. She stood beside the pickup, staring at the rejection letter. Then her phone rang. It was Dennis. I ran the old records against the current cattle. Emily listened. There is something you need to know. What? Atlas isn't just related to Cedar Ridge for 17. Emily's grip tightened. He is the closest living descendant I found in this county. Emily looked across the wet parking lot. Are you sure? I checked the lineage twice. A pause. Then Dennis said something that made Emily stop breathing. Your grandfather may have been right all along. What do you mean? He may have been building a herd that could outperform commercial cattle without expensive feed. Emily looked down at the rejected loan, then toward home. For the first time, the debt didn't look like the end. It looked like a deadline. She returned to the farm and pulled the old Farmel M from the shed. The tractor had belonged to her grandfather. Its paint was faded red. One headlight was missing. The steering wheel was wrapped in electrical tape. Emily climbed onto the seat. She pulled the choke, pressed the starter. The engine coughed. Stopped. She tried again. Nothing. She opened the hood. The fuel line was clogged. She cleaned it with a piece of wire, then tried again. The Farmel roared awake. Emily smiled for the first time in weeks. She spent the next 3 days repairing fences, laying water pipe, and dividing the pasture into rotational paddocks. Every improvement cost money. Every mistake cost more. And every evening, Atlas followed her along the fence. Then, in early April, Emily made a decision that could either save the farm or destroy it. She selected 8 cows for Atlas. Not the biggest, not the prettiest, the healthiest, strong feet, quiet dispositions, good maternal history. She had learned from her grandfather's notes. Breathe the weaknesses out. Protect the strengths. The first cow entered the breeding pasture. Atlas walked toward her. Emily watched from outside the fence. No rushing, no aggression, just a slow, deliberate approach. Dennis had told her to expect trouble. Instead, Atlas behaved exactly as her grandfather's notes had predicted. Quiet, controlled, patient. By the end of the afternoon, Emily had 8 cows with Atlas. It should have felt like victory. Instead, she noticed something strange. Atlas wasn't looking at the cows. He was staring beyond them, toward the old north pasture, toward the buried marker, toward the place where the brass tag had been found. Emily followed his gaze, and then she saw a man standing beside the fence. Harold Voss. He wasn't smiling this time. He was holding an old photograph, and from the expression on his face, Emily knew he had finally realized what she had found. Harold Voss stood on the other side of the fence with rain darkening the shoulders of his brown canvas coat. He held the photograph loosely in one hand. Emily stopped beside Atlas. Neither of them spoke. Harold finally lifted the photograph. Your grandfather kept this. Emily nodded. I found it. No, Harold said. You found one copy. He reached into his coat and produced another. This one was older. The edges were burned. Emily recognized the handwriting immediately. Her grandfather's. She opened the gate. Harold stepped through. Atlas watched him carefully. Harold looked at the bull. He has the head. Emily said nothing. The same shoulders, too. Then you knew what he was. Harold's eyes remained on Atlas. I knew what his blood could do. That wasn't the answer Emily wanted. What happened to the original herd? Harold rubbed his jaw. Your grandfather wanted to keep every daughter. Said the females with foundation. He was right. Then why did you buy them? Because the bank forced him to sell. Emily's face tightened. You bought the cows. Some. And the bull. Yes. What happened after? Harold looked away. My operation expanded. Yours collapsed. The words landed harder than Emily expected. You could have returned them. Harold looked directly at her. I should have. It was the first apology Emily had heard from him, but it wasn't enough. What happened to the bloodline? Harold handed her the second photograph. On the back was a list of cattle numbers. For 17.418.419, Emily recognized the pattern. These are daughters. Harold nodded. Most of them were sold across 3 states. And Atlas, born from one of the last surviving daughters. Emily looked at the bull. How did you know? Because I kept the records. Then why send him here? Harold's expression changed. Because I thought you would fail. Emily stared at him. Harold continued. Your grandfather spent years trying to prove that cattle could be selected for efficiency instead of size alone. I thought he was stubborn. And now, Harold looked toward the pasture. Now I think he was 20 years ahead of us. Before Emily could answer, a truck appeared at the end of the lane. Dennis Cole stepped out. He carried a sample cooler. I've got the lab results. Harold turned. What lab? Dennis looked at Emily. The feed trial. Emily frowned. What feed trial? Dennis opened the cooler. Inside were 4 sealed sample bags. He explained that he had compared Emily's pasture forage with samples from 3 larger commercial operations. The results surprised everyone. Emily's renovated north pasture contained a mixture of cool-season grasses and legumes that provided unusually high-quality forage in spring. But the important part wasn't the protein. It was the mineral balance. The pasture was naturally providing more of what Atlas needed than the commercial ration Harold had been feeding him. Emily looked at Dennis. So the expensive feed wasn't helping him? Not necessarily. Harold's expression hardened. How much? Dennis looked at him. Enough to explain part of his performance. Harold shook his head. Part. Dennis nodded. The rest is genetics. That word changed the atmosphere. Genetics. Not luck. Not appearance. Not size. Emily walked toward Atlas. The bull lowered his head. She placed her palm against his forehead. She remembered her grandfather's old note, do not lose this line. Now she understood. The line had survived because somebody had been patient enough to preserve it, and because Atlas had been sent to a young woman nobody believed in. But another problem appeared almost immediately. One of Emily's cows miscarried. The veterinarian found no infection. The cow was otherwise healthy. Emily panicked. If the remaining pregnancies failed, the entire plan was finished. She called Dennis. He came the next morning. He examined the cow, then the pasture. Then Atlas. We need to know whether this is isolated. How? Pregnancy checks. Emily swallowed. Now. They gathered the herd. The work took hours. When Dennis finished, he gave Emily the results. 7 confirmed pregnancies. 1 loss. Emily exhaled. 7 calves. Not enough to save the farm, but enough to continue. Then Dennis added something. There's something unusual. Emily looked up. What? The cows carrying Atlas's calves are holding condition better than I'd expect. Meaning, early signs suggest the calves may be developing efficiently. Emily didn't celebrate. She had learned not to, because the biggest test hadn't happened yet. The calves had to be born, and the county had started watching. By May, the story had spread. A young farmer had taken the biggest white bull in the county. Some said she was wasting good cows. Others said Harold Voss had dumped an animal on her because he was too expensive to maintain. At the feed store, 2 men laughed when Emily walked in. One of them said loudly, "Careful, Emily. That giant snowball might eat your whole farm." The other laughed. Emily paid for her fencing staples. She didn't answer. Outside, Dennis was waiting. You hear them? Yes. You gonna prove them wrong? Emily looked toward the pasture. No. Dennis smiled. What? I don't need to prove anything. She walked toward the truck. I just need the calves to. That sentence stayed with Dennis. By June, the first calf arrived. A heifer, strong, black and white. She stood within minutes. Emily crouched beside her. The calf's legs were straight. Her breathing was steady. The mother cleaned her carefully. Emily checked the calf's weight. 88 pounds. Healthy, not enormous. That mattered. The second calf arrived 2 days later. 84 pounds. The third weighed 91. The fourth, 86. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Healthy birth weights. Fast standing. Strong nursing. Quiet mothers. By the seventh birth, Emily was keeping a notebook, not because she wanted to win, because she wanted to understand. She recorded everything. Birth weight, time to stand, time to nurse, dam behavior, calf behavior, weather, pasture condition, feed intake, and something else. How much the calves ate as they grew. The numbers were strange. They gained weight quickly while consuming as much supplemental feed as neighboring calves. Dennis noticed it too. So did Harold. He visited without announcing himself. He stood by the fence for nearly an hour. Atlas was grazing. His calves were scattered around the pasture. Harold finally said, "How much are they eating?" Emily answered, "Less than expected." "How much less?" "About 18%. Harold looked at her. "That can't be right." "I measured it." He looked back at the calves, then at Atlas. "Your grandfather would have liked this." Emily nodded. He already knew. But the summer brought drought. By July, rain stopped. The grass turned brown. Neighboring farmers began feeding hay. Emily's pasture held longer. The legumes remained green beneath the taller grass. The old soil management system her grandfather had used decades earlier was finally showing its value. Then the county announced a summer livestock showcase. The prize for best young sire was $7,500. Emily entered Atlas. Harold entered one of his own bulls, a massive black Angus named Kingmaker. Kingmaker was famous. Atlas wasn't. At the weigh-in, people gathered around Atlas. His size attracted them. But the judges weren't impressed by size alone. They wanted structure, feet, temperament, condition, progeny performance. One judge ran a hand down Atlas's back. Another examined his hind legs. A third checked his teeth. Then the judge asked Emily, "How old is he?" 4. "Who trained him?" Emily looked at Atlas. "No one." The judge raised an eyebrow. "He's unusually calm." Emily nodded. He was handled quietly. Then Kingmaker entered the ring. The crowd cheered. Harold stood beside the chute. Emily watched Atlas. He wasn't looking at Kingmaker. He was watching the gate. When the two bulls finally stood side by side, the difference became obvious. Kingmaker was heavier. Atlas was deeper through the chest. His feet were square. His back was level. His movement was easy. The judge walked around both animals. Then came the final test. The young sires were evaluated beside several of their calves. Atlas's calves entered the ring. 7 of them, all healthy, all uniform, all quiet. The crowd became silent. One judge crouched beside the smallest heifer. He looked at her legs, then her shoulder, then her ribs. He stood. "What are these calves eating?" Emily answered, "Mostly pasture." The judge looked at her. "Mostly grass and legumes. Some mineral." The judge looked back at Atlas, then at the calves. And suddenly Harold's face changed. He knew. The bull everyone had mocked was producing exactly what commercial cattlemen had been paying thousands of dollars to achieve. Efficient calves, strong feet, easy temperament, good growth, and they were doing it on pasture. The announcer called the finalists. Kingmaker, Atlas. Emily stood beside the chute. Her hands were shaking. She looked down. The old brass tag 417 was still in her pocket. She had carried it every day since finding it. The announcer opened the envelope. The crowd leaned forward. "Best young sire." A pause. Then the announcer said Atlas's name. The crowd erupted. Emily didn't move. For several seconds, she simply stared at the bull. Harold walked toward her. He removed his hat. I was wrong. Emily looked at him. He held out his hand. She took it, but the real surprise came afterward. A geneticist from the University of Illinois approached Emily. She introduced herself and asked for permission to collect DNA samples from Atlas and his calves. Why? Emily asked. The scientist looked at the bull. Because this isn't just a good sire. She glanced at the brass tag in Emily's hand. We think you may have something the county lost 20 years ago. Emily's heart began pounding. The scientist pointed toward Atlas's calves. This bloodline may carry a combination of traits we've been trying to reproduce through expensive selection programs. Emily looked at Atlas. The bull lowered his head. Behind him, 7 calves stood in the summer grass. For the first time, Emily understood what her grandfather had been trying to preserve. Not a champion, not a giant bull, a system, a way of breeding cattle that worked with the land instead of fighting it. But before she could celebrate, the geneticist looked at her results. Her expression changed. There's one problem. Emily's smile disappeared. What? The scientist turned the DNA report around. Atlas isn't the only surviving male carrying this line. Emily stared at the page. Then who is? The scientist pointed to a registration number. A number Emily had never seen. And beneath it was the name of a ranch that had just announced it was selling its entire herd. The sale was scheduled for Saturday morning. The ranch was 47 miles south of Emily's farm. Its name was Bellwether Stock Farm. By Friday afternoon, Emily had already learned enough about it to make her nervous. The ranch had been operating since 1911. Its herd records went back more than a century. And according to the geneticist, one of its registered bulls carried the same unusual maternal line as Atlas. The bull's name was White River 417. Emily drove there before sunrise. She took the Farmer Lem's old toolbox with her because her grandfather had once told her that if a machine could be repaired with something already in your pocket, you hadn't learned enough about machines yet. The sale barn was crowded. Buyers stood along the rail. Trailers lined the gravel lot. Cattle moved through the chutes. Emily spotted the bull immediately. White River 417 was older than Atlas. Smaller, scarred, but when he turned his head, Emily saw the same pale eyes, the same forehead, the same quiet expression. The geneticist stood beside her. That is the line, she whispered. Emily watched the old bull walk past. He didn't look impressive. But neither had Atlas when everyone first saw him. The sale began. Prices climbed. Emily couldn't compete. Then something unexpected happened. Harold Voss walked into the ring. He was there to buy the bull. Emily knew immediately what he was doing. Harold raised his number. Another buyer raised theirs. Harold raised again. The price climbed beyond what the old bull seemed worth. Finally, Harold stopped. A cattleman from Iowa bought White River 417. Emily watched the trailer leave. She felt something disappear. The geneticist touched her shoulder. You still have Atlas. Emily nodded. But one bull isn't enough. No, Emily said. It's not. She drove home thinking about her grandfather's records. That night, she spread every page across the kitchen table. Then she noticed something she had missed. A small notation in the margin beside Silver Bell. Preserved through daughters. Do not concentrate too heavily. Emily read it again. Her grandfather had wanted one champion bull. He had wanted a resilient herd, a population, something that could survive bad weather, bad markets, and bad decisions. Atlas was never supposed to be the whole answer. He was supposed to reopen the door. The next morning, Emily called the geneticist. I want to test every daughter. Every one I can afford. That decision changed the farm. Emily stopped chasing the biggest animals. She selected for feet, fertility, temperament, calving ease, forage efficiency, and maternal ability. She kept records on everything. She measured pasture. She weighed calves. She tracked supplemental feed. She repaired fences before they failed. She tested water twice a year. She stopped trying to make the farm look successful. She made it work. Atlas became the center of the program. But nature remained the final judge. The summer of 2023 brought another drought. Then winter came early. Several neighboring farms bought expensive feed. Emily's herd survived mostly on stored forage and rotational grazing. By spring, Atlas's daughters were calving. The first one delivered without assistance. So did the second, then the third. The calves stood quickly. The mothers stayed calm, and the pasture recovered faster than Emily expected. Dennis Cole visited in April. He walked through the north field. Then he crouched and pressed his fingers into the soil. Your grandfather would recognize this. Emily smiled. What? The farm. That was all he said. By 2024, buyers were driving from 3 states to see the cattle. Not because Atlas was huge, because his daughters were becoming valuable. A rancher from Missouri bought 4. A family in Indiana bought 3. A commercial herd in Iowa bought 6. The same cattlemen who had laughed at Emily now asked for breeding contracts. Emily refused most of them. She wanted the bloodline distributed carefully, not concentrated in one wealthy operation. The county noticed. At the annual livestock showcase, Atlas returned at 5 years old. He was no longer the young curiosity. He was the bull everyone came to see. His calves stood around him in the ring. Some were red, some black, some white-faced. All carried the same quiet strength. The judge who had awarded him the young sire title years earlier walked into the ring. He looked at Atlas, then at the calves, then at Emily. You changed the county's breeding program. Emily shook her head. No. She looked at the cattle. The land did. The judge smiled. You finally learned your grandfather's lesson. Emily looked down. She thought about the brass tag. 417. She still carried it. That evening, Harold Voss came to the farm. He walked slowly toward the pasture. Emily found him standing beside Atlas. The old cattleman rested his hand against the bull's neck. I sent him here because I thought you couldn't handle him. Emily said nothing. Harold looked across the pasture. I was wrong twice. Twice. I underestimated him. He paused. Then I underestimated you. Emily smiled faintly. Harold handed her an envelope. Inside was an old photograph. Her grandfather stood beside Cedar Ridge for 17. On the back was a handwritten sentence Emily had never seen. One day, someone will understand why this mattered. Emily folded the photograph carefully. I think I do now. Harold nodded. Then he did something nobody expected. He asked Emily for a daughter from Atlas. Not for free. Not as a favor. He wanted to buy one. Emily agreed. 5 years later, Carter Farm looked different. The old shed had been repaired. The fences were straight. The north pasture was green. The farm still worked. Emily kept it exactly as her grandfather had left it. The bank debt was gone. The farm had expanded from 12 cattle to 86. But the most important change wasn't the number of cattle. It was the people. Young farmers began visiting Emily to learn rotational grazing. Older farmers brought their records. The county extension office began using her herd as a local case study, and Dennis Cole retired. At his retirement dinner, he stood beside Emily and raised a glass. I spent 30 years telling farmers what the land should do. He looked at her. She taught me to listen instead. Emily laughed quietly. Atlas never became famous outside Illinois. He didn't need to. His daughters carried his influence into other herds. 5 years after the trailer arrived, one of his granddaughters won the county's Best Maternal Cow Award. Another produced a calf that weighed 92 pounds at birth and reached 600 pounds on pasture before weaning. The numbers kept proving what Emily had first noticed in the mud. The bull wasn't the miracle. The land wasn't the miracle. The bloodline wasn't the miracle. The understanding was. One cold morning in November 2027, Emily walked into the north pasture alone. Atlas was old now. His steps were slower. His white coat had yellowed around the shoulders. But when he saw Emily, he lifted his head. She walked to him. Her boots sank into damp soil. The morning mist hung low over the grass. Behind Atlas, 3 generations of his descendants grazed quietly. Emily placed her hand against his neck. You were never supposed to be here, she whispered. Atlas breathed slowly. Emily looked toward the pasture her grandfather had once fought to keep. The grass moved gently in the November wind. The old bull lowered his head and began grazing. Emily stood beside him. For a moment, there was nothing to fix, nothing to prove, nothing left to chase. Just cattle moving through wet grass beneath a pale Midwestern sunrise, and the old farmer lamb sitting quietly beside the barn. Its red had caught the first light. Then the engine turned once and started. If a story like Emily's reminds you of someone in your own family, tell us about them below. Maybe it was a grandfather who knew every field by memory, a mother who kept a farm alive when nobody believed she could, or an old machine that somehow refuses to quit. We read these stories because farming history isn't only about crops and cattle. It's about the people who stayed when leaving would have been easier. And next time, we'll follow another young farmer who discovers that something everyone else considers worthless may be exactly what her land has been waiting for.